Thank you for joining us on this beautiful afternoon for Gardening with Nature, Larry Lederman in conversation with Todd Forrest. I'm Latoya Strong, the Director of Continuing Education. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the New York Botanical Garden is located on the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. We honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. In addition to today's program, NYBG offers many classes, workshops, and public lectures in landscape design, floral design, gardening, and much more. Here are a few of our upcoming events. Our summer intensive programs are open for registration, so you or a loved one can get a jump start on your certificate in landscape design, floral design, or gardening this summer. On June 12th in the Mertz Library, Frances Palmer will discuss her latest book, Life with Flowers, followed by a workshop in the afternoon. Richard Smith, our director for the School of Professional Horticulture, will be in conversation with Professor Jarvis McInnes to discuss McInnes's research on the agrarian South in his book, Afterlives of the Plantation. This will take place on June 18th in Mertz Library. And finally, on August 12th, art historian Giovanni Alloy will present his latest book, Botanical Revolutions, in an online lecture. Now for today's event. Larry Lederman, who will be speaking first, came to photography after a successful career in corporate law. The New York Botanical Garden quickly became one of the self-taught photographer's favorite subjects. Gregory Long, former president of the New York Botanical Garden, writes in his introduction to Lederman's 2014 book, Magnificent Trees of NYBG, Larry has developed a particular lyrical and artistic view of the garden. Throughout the garden's 125-year history, no other observers have known and documented these collections so thoroughly. Many of you have probably seen these stunning photos in the garden hanging in offices and in classrooms in the Watson Building, and also outside right now in Ross Gallery. Todd Forrest is our Arthur Ross Vice President for Horticulture and Living Collections. He first came to NYBG almost 30 years ago as a research assistant in the Institute for Economic Botany. Todd is an expert advocate for historic trees, forests, and urban landscapes, and has been actively involved in the restoration and enhancement of our collections across his 250 acres. Together, Larry and Todd will present their love letter to and cultural history of the New York Botanical Garden from Larry's latest book, Gardening with Nature at the New York Botanical Garden. Please take a moment to silence your phones and join me in welcoming Larry Lederman to the stage.
It's good to be here. We'll try to have some fun today, if we could. This is a fairly old picture. I took this in 2011, and it's wonderful in that the dam that was created by Laurelon, so it actually predates the garden, and it's really just an industrial set of artifact to create water power. And here it is. It's probably one of the most beautiful spots in the garden. And as a photograph, it is sort of, it's magical because you have something which you normally don't have in a reflection. What you have is you have the reflection on the top and the reality on the bottom. It's usually the reverse. You have this wonderful line of blue right down the side, and you have this golden bridge here, and it has a sense of a circle, and you have this enormous feeling of movement. Now, what makes the picture interesting is that it's not taken head on, it's taken from the side. So you even have a sense of a circle when in fact it's not a circle, it is in fact just a straight bridge right across damming the river. So it is, in a sense, it sort of defies the eye in that there's magic here, and it doesn't really reflect the reality of what's there, but it reflects the artistry of photography. we're seeing here the garden through a veil. The composition is set up in such a way that the Katsura tree this is the spring. I have another photograph of this Katsura tree, I think in this group. And you have the magic of the spring, and you are looking through into Daffodil Valley here. And the drapery of the tree itself gives you a sense of movement, and as does the shadow, which is sort of interesting because it doesn't seem to belong, and yet what it does, it firmly plants the tree. So when we talk about taking a picture, people talk about capture. In fact, capture is really the wrong word. The word really is you're taking a photograph. Capture means that it's evasive and elusive, and that somehow it's going to move. This doesn't move. What you do, the photographer has to move. And it's the photographer that decides what the point of view is and what you're going to see. But you can see the beauty of the garden here in a gracious way that you ordinarily wouldn't if you just didn't position yourself to see through the tree. This is another industrial aspect of the garden. This is the quarry. And it is, from my perspective, one of the grand sculptures in the garden. It is not an industrial mess. It is something quite beautiful. And the photograph is taken from the right-hand corner, and it gives you a stage and a field in which this sculpture can be seen, and you get a sense of the naturalness of the land around it. And its beauty is the fact that it has now become part of the landscape. Again, this is a framing device. We see Daffodil Hill through the tree, and in this case, you get a sense of movement through the photograph because of the walkway. And there's one here, which leads the line across, and as does the tree itself, which frames it, and the landscape, which leads you all the way through. You get a sense of the depth of the valley. And it's sort of a privileged position because you're standing on a hill and you're looking through. This is Daffodil Hill, and you're looking down and across. This is the valley, Daffodil Valley, which is right outside of this building. What the photograph does is it gives you a sense of the line of the daffodils right through, and a sense of the daffodils meeting and then traveling across the picture. And the trees themselves create a weight, counterweight, and balance out all this movement and give you the path leads your eye through the frame. This is the same picture as the Katsura tree. It's the same tree that we just saw, which was this is the fall. And that was the picture which we looked through the veil. And here it is, we're on the other side of the veil. So the photography is that you walk around. The most important aspect of photography is not the camera, it's your feet. You got to get yourself lined up in the proper place. The tree on the left does two things. It creates a frame, and it also creates its branch, which is extraordinary creates movement and forces the eye into the frame. And it also, what it does, there's a yin and a yang here. That tree is delicate and is like a fancy dress, and this tree is sort of like the guy standing at the gate, sort of a thuggish in a way compared to the delicacy of the tree. This is the wonderful picture in that you have the sky at both ends in the reflection. As a photographer, it's impossible to not enjoy reflections. And I'm always surprised when I see people photographing and there's water and there's no reflection. You can't pass it. It's just inevitable that you have to be able to have the sky at least reflect it. This is a native plant garden, and it gives you a wonderful feel for the meadow. So the point of view is, again, in the corner here, so that there is a foreground, a middle ground, and a sky. And that leads you through and gives you the depth and a sense of movement in the curve of the water, because in fact is the structure. The structure is geometric. And yet the way we're looking at it, it is anything but geometric. This is the oak area, and you see the majesty of the oaks against the hydrangeas here. And you have a path that runs the eye through, but you're sort of getting a sense of peeking over them and enjoying them. So you again have a foreground, a middle ground, and a sense of the depth of the area. That's it.
Thank you, Larry, and hello, everybody. I'm deeply grateful that you decided to take an hour or so of this beautiful spring day to spend inside listening to us. I think with Larry's presentation, you see why it has been such a joy for me to work with him. We've worked together on 3 books about the garden, and I've worked with him on some of his other books that he's written about other gardens and other places. He's got an artist's eye, and a merger and acquisitions attorney's relentless grit. It's a good combo. He gets things done. He mostly gets other people to do things, as best I can tell. So anyway, Larry was the perfect partner to tell a story that has been, for me, 27 years in the making. And when Larry came to me with an idea to do another book together, the idea for this book really seemed obvious to me. And the reason why it seemed obvious is because I've been living this story and thinking about this story for 27 years. And I conceived of this book as LaToya said, sort of love letter to this place and this institution. Because I have a perspective of this institution that is just born of spending every day here, year in and year out, and with every passing year, kind of valuing what the garden does for its staff, for the city, and for the world every day. So the pictures are Larry's, and they're brilliant. The words are mine, and they are what they are. We have a program. After this, if I do this all in time, Larry and I will have a conversation and answer any questions. So I'm going to go through not the entire book, and I'm going to go through as quickly as I can. But if brevity is the soul of wit, people who know me, I'm at the very least witless and probably soulless. So a little bit about the history of the institution. This great institution was formed in the late 19th century, really by the OG power couple, Nathaniel and Elizabeth Britton. They were basically late 19th century naturalists, geologists, botanists, people who loved nature and who went on their honeymoon to London and visited the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew and came back completely inspired to create a Kew for America in New York. And by a Kew for America, I mean a traditional 19th century botanical garden that combines a three-part mission of botanical science, education at every level, and horticulture, the care and feeding of the plants to serve the science and education missions. So this was the third of the great cultural institutions that were created in New York in the late 19th century. So this institution is part of a wave that was happening in New York in the late 19th century. First, the American Museum of Natural History, then the Met, then NYBG. I think we should all be grateful to the philanthropists, the Gilded Age tycoons, who really supported the creation of these institutions in an effort to make New York, which was known as a capital of commerce, as a capital of culture. And we are all the beneficiaries of their foresight and their generosity. It was also at the head of another wave, and that was a wave of creating green space in urban areas. And of course, maybe the most famous green space in any urban area, certainly in America, and one of them in the world, is Central Park, which was created in the middle of the 19th century. Here's a picture of the Greensward plan that Olmsted and Vaux used to craft and create Central Park. And this was such a successful addition to New York City that it created a new parks movement. Which in 1884 advocated for the creation of 3,500 acres of parkland in the Bronx, just north of their Central Park in Manhattan, so north is this direction. And the New Parks Act of 1884 set aside 3,500 acres of parkland, and actually what had just been annexed to New York City, the Western Bronx, and what was going to be annexed in 1895, the Eastern Bronx. 3,500 acres of parkland felt like a really wonderful addition, and the success of Central Park convinced everybody that this was a worthy investment. And again, just like we are the beneficiaries of the folks who made the cultural institutions, we are also the beneficiaries of the people who set aside all this parkland. And to this very day, the Bronx is the greenest borough in New York City, and we have them to thank. So the Britons, in 1891, the garden was created by an act of the state legislature of New York. And the first thing that was required of this fledgling institution was that we raise $250,000. That's the equivalent of about $9 million in 2025 dollars to support the establishment of the institution's program. So our very first act as an institution was raising money, and that seems to not have slowed down since 1891. Once the $250,000 was raised, the Britons were given the choice of several spots within this new parkland that had been established in the Bronx. And they instantly knew the spot they wanted. The spot they chose was the northern half of Bronx Park, and they chose it primarily because of the 50-acre old-growth hemlock grove and the Bronx River. This little kernel of nature at the edge of the expanding nature, which was considered in the 1890s to be the most important bit of nature anywhere in or around New York City. And then even around that kernel of nature were a series of old farm fields and pastures shaded by really old, mature, and gorgeous native trees that had been preserved during the post-agricultural era that the Bronx really was actually just leaving. And so it was nature that drove the Britons to this site. It was actual wildness, and it was actual wild plants and the beauty of nature that made them choose this site, which is very different than the sites of Kew or the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. Those are more formal gardens, more design gardens in the middle of urban centers. The idea behind this landscape, this institution, was to create nature as the core and to build all the botanical and horticultural and educational infrastructure on top of that nature while respecting and preserving it. So, when they laid out the garden was originally laid out by Britton and Calvert Vaux, who was Olmsted's partner in the creation of Central Park. Unfortunately, Calvert Vaux passed away in 1895, so Britton partnered with a man named John Brindley to complete the design. But instantly, or written into the original design, were a few things. First was the preservation of the forest, the 50-acre forest, and the other thing was a commitment to preserving the natural character through the design. So for example, when they laid out the roads, Britain decreed that no healthy tree should be cut down to install a road anywhere. So you can see the impacts of that. Literally, the garden's roads and pathways kind of snaked around and through and between and around roads. A very intentional decision to preserve those amazing native trees. And then the planted landscapes were planned to be naturalistic. I don't know if you can read the quote because of the chair, but Britain said, the rectilinear treatment of plant beds found in most of the older gardens, meaning the European gardens, has become abhorrent to landscape lovers, and therefore the planting should follow as nearly as possible a natural treatment. He was not just thinking about nature in terms of the site, but a naturalistic approach to planting across the site. So this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. A lot of the content of my life are internal arguments that I'm having with no one else. And one that I've often had with no one else is that Central Park gets just absolutely well-deserved accolades for its design and for the brilliance of its siting. The New York Botanical Garden, because it's built in and around nature, has never received the same level of accolades. So when I found this quote from Charles Sargent, who was the original tree bro, he was the founder of the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, and he was a Boston guy. And just like Red Sox Yankees, there's always been a little bit of back and forth between New York and Boston. And in writing in his own, he had published his own magazine, so he could write whatever he wanted. It's called Garden and Forest. It's lovely. I should add that the historic images and the quotes all came from the archives of the Louis or T. Mertz Library, which is the most amazing resource ever. But anyway, you can get copies of Garden and Forest, and in describing, there was a spat about the way that Britton and Brindley had located the conservatory and their initial sketch for the garden, and Sargent was very unhappy with it because he felt that it really negatively impacted the natural beauty of the site. So, and I will read this because it's lovely. No city in the world possesses more beautiful scenery or a park area more thoroughly characteristic of what is most delightful in the landscape of the part of the world in which it is situated than does New York and Bronx Park. That's where we are now. The city spent money like water to create some charming natural scenery in what is now Central Park by blasting out ridges of rock, filling in the spaces of the soil, and turning this desert of stone into a tree-flecked meadowland. Now that it has come into possession of scenery far more beautiful and ready-made, it would be folly to destroy it. Take that, Central Park. And in case you're wondering whether or not he was maybe exaggerating, this is a landscape painting of the site that became Central Park before it was Central Park. I think this is around the area of Bethesda Terrace. Beautiful, but not this. This was the landscape that is the Thane family forest today, that was called the Hemlock Grove then, that was the nature upon which the garden was built. So, in the rest of my talk, I'm going to go through and look at a handful of sites across the garden and talk about that initial instinct to preserve and celebrate nature that the garden's founders had, and then all the subsequent generations, including the current generation's commitment to continuing that preservation of nature, but also to be very careful and thoughtful about preserving the work of our predecessors. We all stand on the shoulders of the people who came before us. What makes this landscape, this garden, so amazing is its history, but also that it's always redefining itself and reinventing itself to better serve a contemporary audience. And I think everybody who comes to work at a place like this or visit a place like this understands inherently the value that direct experience in nature can have. So we're very mindful of that as we do our work across the landscape. So we'll start with the Thane family forest, which was of course called the Hemlock Grove. So you see in the original Brindley and Britton plan, the entire Hemlock Grove, which is on the west bank of the Bronx River, north is this way in this drawing, was preserved. The original site for the conservatory was where the rock garden is now. That was the argument that Sargent had with Britton. It was moved to its actual site where it is now. The library building, initial thought for the Tulip Tree LA, and then the historic deciduous arboretum collections. Just as much wildness as they could muster and preserve and protect across the entire 250 acres. And we are all, again, the beneficiaries of that forest site. If you walk through the forest now, it feels timeless. It is indeed ancient. It might not be exactly the way New York was in the 1600s or 1400s, but it is very, very, very close. And if it's not exactly in terms of composition of plants, it is exactly in terms of the natural energy that informs its change. And Larry's photographs of the forests really document that beautifully. Sort of a side note about this project, Larry, as I said, has a very strong artistic vision, and his artistic vision doesn't normally include taking pictures of things that are not, to his eye, at least directly or immediately beautiful. So a lot of this combination was us sort of arguing about what had to be photographed and Larry turning it into something beautiful. And I'm really grateful to Larry for taking the notes and trying to put my vision of what is beautiful about the garden and make it come alive through his camera. So the incredible ratio of ancient old trees to new young trees, that is the energy of a natural forest. Ephemeral pools, coarse woody debris. You know, Larry, please take a picture of fallen trees. It's like, well, I'm not sure. No. I need you to take a picture of fallen trees. But why are fallen trees important? Because this is the future forest. That's a 200-year-old tree that came down, and the nutrients within that trunk are going to decompose, and they're going to feed the forest of the future. It's a hallmark characteristic of an old-growth forest, an important consideration. So as you go through the Thane family forest, please take a moment to sort of not just notice the kind of the cathedral-like scale of the trees, but the details of the nature that's happening all around you. And of course, the Bronx River, which is New York City's only freshwater river, and along with the forest, the reason why the garden was established on this site. And we're excited now to be working with people throughout the Bronx and Westchester to not only protect the Bronx River and its riparian zone, but to work with people to protect the Bronx River by protecting the entire watershed. The next area we looked at is Daffodil Hill, which might not seem at first blush like traditionally gardening with nature, but it's kind of an interesting story, and it makes me appreciate how gardening with nature can take many forms. So the first thing is that Daffodil Hill, the site that is now Daffodil Hill, was not part of the original garden layout. The garden was 250 acres in 1895. It expanded to 400 acres in 1915 with the addition of the land that's mostly the south end of the garden and a little bit to the east. When that land was added in 1915, the newly formed Women's Auxiliary Committee, which had been established in 1914, had been advocating to Britain and others that NYBG needed some more ornamental horticulture. They loved the nature, they loved the tree collections, they loved the educational component of the landscape, but they felt that maybe it didn't reflect enough of the fashion of beautiful gardens that was coming into America from England at that time. And so they used this new land to create a series of ornamental gardens. The first rock garden, which is on that giant rock that's right over Daffodil Hill, an old iris garden and some formal gardens that were created for a horticultural convention held in the 1920s, and the iris collections. For those of you, any long-term Bronx residents here? Everyone know what that building is? It's the old Fordham Hospital. A mammoth old building that's long gone. It's now a parking garage. But anyway, the driver of this whole operation was a woman named Ethel Anson Peckham, that woman right there. And she was the honorary curator of irises and narcissus. And so they put together these really elaborate, and I would argue over-elaborate, horticultural gardens on Daffodil Hill, and they didn't last long at all. They were overwrought. They didn't quite flow with the natural landscape. They took too much work to take care of. But what did last, and there's Ethel Anson Peckham right there, was Daffodil Hill with the daffodils themselves. In 1924, she planted tens of thousands of daffodils, did the same in 25 and 26, and then the planting of daffodils sort of tailed off. And unlike the iris beds and the canna beds, the daffodils were planted in concert with the remarkable natural landscape of that part of the garden. It had been cleared with these rolling hills and exposed rock outcrops. It was quite beautiful. And this is, I think, 1926, just a few years after that process started. And then around about 1930, it stopped. We stopped planting daffodils. We didn't care for the daffodils that were there. It was kind of a forgotten landscape. So if you fast forward to 2013, we started thinking about the garden's 125th anniversary, which was coming up. And one idea that we had was the idea of planting 1 million more daffodils on Daffodil Hill. So this is our modern day Ethel Anselm Peckham. It's Kristen Schleider, who was curator of herbaceous plants at the time and a great fan of daffodils and so knowledgeable and so passionate. And she drove the selection of new daffodils that would be planted to complement the remaining daffodils. So in 2013, we hadn't added a single daffodil to Daffodil Hill since 1930, basically. But still, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of daffodils persisted. The most sustainable garden that you can imagine. And so Kristen got to working with daffodil breeders, Brent and Becky Bulb, to find a series of modern daffodil cultivars that fit with the remnant historic heirloom cultivars that persisted on Daffodil Hill. So we planted about 150,000 the first year and about 150,000 the next year, and we've continuously planting on and on and on, and kind of lost count. Probably planted several 100,000, maybe close to 1 million. But what we know that for every daffodil that we planted, within 2 or 3 years, that turns into 5 daffodils. So we've added about at least 2.5 million, maybe even more daffodils to Daffodil Hill. And it was so great to work with Larry, you've seen this picture already, to capture it. Anybody who has been out there usually peaks around the 3rd week of April. It is like, it just draws human beings in ways that you can't even imagine. And what's wonderful about daffodils, they take no care. We don't have to fertilize them. We have been dividing and transplanting daffodils, the heirloom ones in particular, to fill in gaps. But we basically plant the daffodils, let them grow. We let the grass get long, and then around about the end of June, beginning of July, we cut it back, and that's all we do. And it's got it has an extraordinary impact, and it is incredibly enticing to visitors, and people just come back year after year after year. It's even a remarkable landscape in the middle of winter. So that's gardening with nature. We took a site that was very simple. We added something that didn't take a lot of extra work. And now daffodils don't maybe drive pollinators as well as some other plants do, but they certainly do not cause any harm. They're not invasive. They don't really spread into our natural areas. It's a perfect way to add a little bit of joyful beauty to a garden in a way that really aligns with the nature of the site. The rock garden. Another garden that is, in many ways, represents the apogee of kind of horticultural sophistication, but it has a spirit of gardening with nature that I hope you'll see both in its history and its current pictures. It was created by T.H. Everett, who was my predecessor. He worked here between 1932 and 1967. He came to the U.S. in 1927 to work at Greystone, which was the Untermeyer Garden in Yonkers, which over the past 2 decades or so has been being restored. If you haven't been there, you should go. It's pretty amazing. But he was enticed to come over to NYBG from Greystone, and one of the conditions that he put on coming to NYBG was that he be able to create a rock garden, a natural rock garden in the Robinsonian sense. And so this is the site that he chose. It's the current site of the rock garden. It was an opening. You can see there was a little drainage ditch down the middle and some wonderful mature old trees. Remember, Britain had directed the preservation of trees, and all of that was incorporated into Everett's conception for the rock garden. You can see the existing rock outcrops, and you can see they just started some work clearing the site in 1932. The great thing about the New York Botanical Garden is we have plenty of rock. We have rock everywhere. Rock comes up, rock is in the way, we're moving rock, we're removing rock. And Everett did that for several years, just gathered bits and pieces of rock from here and there across the landscape and used our native rock, which is mostly schist and gneiss, to create the rock features. He was very adamant that rock should be arranged and laid in the landscape in a way that makes it look as if it was there naturally. That's what he referred to when he meant when he referred to a natural rock garden. And there's no better way to do this than to use rock from your site if you're lucky enough to have the amount of rock. So all these years later, the rock garden still bears Everett's design and plantsmanship, but it still feels as if it just emerged from the site. Again, a classic example of gardening with nature. And this black oak, unfortunately, is no longer with us, but it was preserved during the construction of the garden and lived till about 5 or 6 years ago. So, big old native shade trees are not the first thing that a rock garden calls for, but because of this long tradition of preserving those trees, Everett integrated it into the garden, and we kept it alive for as long as we could. It's a beautiful garden that I think is best known and most celebrated for right now. It's a beautiful garden in May. You should all rush out after this is done. But it really is also a year-round garden. And over the past few years, we've been keeping the rock garden open year-round, and we only close it when it snows a lot because we can't shovel the paths because they're made of loose gravel. So I encourage you to visit the rock garden in every season. The azalea garden. This is the classic example of gardening with the site you have. So adapt your garden to your site rather than adapt your site to the garden. So this had been established as an azalea collection in the late 1960s. In 1969, it was called the Baldwin Azalea Garden. Previously, we'd had another azalea garden in what is now called the South Forest. But as you can see, there were azaleas and there were trees, but there wasn't much of a garden there. So we worked with our colleagues at Uma van Sweden to come up with a plan for transforming this historic azalea collection into an azalea garden. We also worked with our colleagues Towers Goldie, and I think Siobhan is here. Siobhan, are you here? There's Siobhan, who is basically the Olmsted of the New York Botanical Garden. If you think of every major project we've done over the past 30 years, Siobhan has been the designer for it, frankly. A beautiful and sensitive approach to, again, like we do in horticulture, respecting the nature of the site and the traditions of design across the site. Uma van Sweden worked with us to create the patterns of plantings across the landscapes. Again, we wanted to take a collection that was beautiful for a few weeks a year and create a garden that is beautiful 12 months a year. Really, the azalea garden is a botanical garden unto itself. It's got thousands of different kinds of plants. It's got our collections of hosta, of epimedium, of fern, of witch hazel, and of course, azaleas and rhododendrons. And there is no season in which the azalea garden is not filled with a horticultural, botanical, or natural delight. I love this picture, Larry. This is a picture taken, I think you were off the trail for this picture. All right, we'll have to give you a note, but it turned out well. I guess I'll forgive you. My favorite time, because I don't like people, in the azalea garden is in February when the witch hazels are in full flower. And Larry captured this amazing picture of cardinals and the witch hazel, which is quite special. Again, 12 months a year of the azalea garden really exemplifies the concept of gardening with nature, of gardening with the site that you have. The native plant garden, of all the gardens that we've done over the past 30 years, this is the one that might seem outwardly like the most nature forward, but I hope that I've convinced you that everything that we do here at NYBG is nature forward. And again, this garden is amazing because it celebrates the life and legacy of Elizabeth Britton, who not only was a co-founder of the New York Botanical Garden, but who was an absolute expert on our native wildflowers and who created what I believe to be the first plant conservation organization in the world called the Wildflower Preservation Society of America, because she saw that the wildflowers in our forest were disappearing very rapidly, mostly because people were picking them or trampling them. And she reasoned that if wildflowers could disappear so quickly under the watchful eyes of botanists at the New York Botanical Garden, what's happening everywhere else? So she was very conservation-minded. And of course, our scientists have studied the flora of the Northeast since the garden was founded. So this garden initially was created as a way to honor Elizabeth Britton and to celebrate the traditional botanical work of our scientists. The original garden, again, was dedicated in 1940, several years after Elizabeth Britton died. It was really just kind of carved out of a portion of land that had not been used for much of anything. But over time, it grew more sophisticated and more complicated. And ultimately, by the 1980s, maybe some of you remember, it had a series of kind of ersatz ecosystems. There was a little pine barrens, there was a little meadow, there was a little serpentine barren, there was a little limestone cobble, all lovely, and there were lots of great plants in there, but it didn't hold together as a garden very well. And in fact, in some way, because we were creating all these artificial environments, it didn't follow the first rule of gardening with nature, which is to adapt your garden to the site and not the other way around. So we had a native plant garden that was not very nature forward or nature friendly, and frankly, really hard to care for and not very beautiful. This is what it looked like by the end. This area that was lawn had been a meadow. That meadow had been attacked by dodder. Dodder, which is an actually native parasitic plant, and it was just a battle that we couldn't win. So ultimately, it was a native plant garden that was not doing a good job of advertising native plants as garden plants. It was basically there for people like me who loved native plants and just wanted to see them. So we, again, worked with Moving Sweden to create a large design that flipped that said, we have a site, the site has these conditions, we have dry shade, we have wet shade, we have wet sun, we have dry sun, we have sandy loams, acidic soil. What is the range of plants that we can plant in this site? How can we use the site to create and support native plant biodiversity? This is the idea they came up with, and the process of transformation was amazing. For those of you who have been around, that was the old lawn, which of course was planted with tens of thousands of meadow plants. Here's many of the horticulture staff, all of whom are still here with us today, planting literally tens of thousands of plants. This was in 2011, just before Hurricane Irene. They didn't all wash away and didn't all have to be replanted. They survived, and then that's the meadow today. There's much more to talk about with each of these areas. We're managing mugwort in the meadow right now and innovating some interesting ways of dealing with that, but that's a talk for another time. The woodland, that was the old woodland garden. Again, not distinguishable so much from the adjacent Thane family forest. Not a lot of garden there. Beautiful, interesting plants, but nothing to draw in somebody who hadn't already fallen in love with native plants. And again, the idea behind this garden was to use the site to create a beautiful and engaging garden that would seduce people to love native plants. So again, lots and lots and lots and lots of planting, and now a native plant garden, a woodland garden that is intentional in the way that the plants combine with one another, and that is inspiring, and that is multi-layered, and that actually does a better job of supporting native biodiversity than the garden that it replaced. And one of my favorite transitions was from drainage ditch. This is the same ditch that connected to the rock garden site, which is just to the north. And this ditch was mostly fed by an open tap. You know, it would be wet during the raining season, but to keep water flowing, there was an open tap at the top of the rock garden cascade. We wanted to stop that. It didn't seem very sustainable. And so we just transformed this ditch into the reflecting pool in the native plant garden. And what's lovely about that pool is that it's like a reverse frame. It gives the eye a place to rest so that when you walk in the garden with all that's going on, everything around it seems much calmer and much more intentional. And it's quite beautiful throughout the year. And then the Burke Oaks. This is the most recent project. This just opened in 2022. In many ways, this is the project that we've done that is truest to the original 19th century design of the garden, but that also takes best advantage of what was already here. Again, outside of the forest were all these wonderful old farm fields and pastures, and they were, again, shaded by remnant native trees, and the original arboretum plantings were planted to the extent possible amongst those remaining native trees. So it was kind of instant historic arboretum. So these are pictures from soon after the old deciduous arboretum was planted, really quite charming. You can see that their approach to turf was very different than our approach to turf has been. And I look forward to actually reintroducing some of this approach to turf, which we're gonna do going forward with our magnolia collection. A little bit more about that in a minute. But the oaks, you know, they don't have I guess the easy beauty of the azaleas or the daffodils or any of the more floriferous collections. But oaks are the most important trees at the New York Botanical Garden. There are more oaks than any other tree species in the forest. Oaks, as I'm sure you all know, support more species of insects and more species of birds than any other trees in our part of the world. So oaks are really, really, really important. They're also really beautiful. So we designed this collection, again, working with Siobhan and Towers Goldie, to be very respectful to that arboretum tradition and to preserve as much of what was already there as possible, and then just to improve things around the edges. So I love this view of Larry's photo, which shows the paths that Siobhan and Towers Goldie designed. It shows a native oak that predates the establishment of this garden, and then all the sort of hopeful little new oaks that we added to the collection. If any of you is a critic, and you've gone out there and you say, boy, they planted a lot of oaks in a small amount of area, you're absolutely right. We have a hard time not filling in every available bit of space. And so on our left brains are always saying, plant at least 35 feet to 50 feet away from another, and our right brains are saying, screw it, just throw it in there. So there are a lot of oaks. Over time, they'll sort each other out. All right, I'm going to finish up with just two more pictures and then just one more comment. So the future. Again, each of these projects is way deeper and way more complex than I've had time to talk about here. I hope that you all understand the motivation behind these projects from the garden's establishment to today has been to honor nature, to honor tradition, and to create beautiful, compelling, accessible gardens and collections so that the people who use the garden are uplifted by the garden. We, over my career, have restored about 150 of the garden's 250 acres, and all that means that we still have 100 acres to restore. Very excited that we are right now in the design process for two projects. The first is the historic Magnolia collection. How many of you walked through the Magnolias this spring? Yeah, pretty good year for the Magnolias this spring. So it's a remarkable historic collection. It's the age of the oaks. It draws people like you wouldn't believe when the Magnolias are in flower. But over the rest of the year, people don't really go there. So what we're doing is we're working with Towers Goldie again, the Olmsted of the New York Botanical Garden, and then Sarah Price, who's an amazing English garden designer, to take that traditional 19th century arboretum concept, turf and trees and rock and space, and respect it, but add a little something. What we're going to add are predominantly native plant plantings to add seasonality throughout the whole site, but still allow people to walk through and experience the magnolia trees. We're going to add an extensive collection of hydrangeas, so we have a summer hydrangea flowering moment, much like the Mother's Day slope in the azalea garden. And then we're going to change the way that we manage our grass, our lawns, so that in character it will look and feel more like the lawns of the 19th century, and that in ecological function it will do more to support the surrounding nature. Similarly, we're in the design process for a river walk along the Bronx River on the south end of the garden. This is just south of the stone mill, and I wouldn't be surprised if any of you who are regular visitors have never been here. It's the only place in the garden where you can get easy access to the Bronx River. It's amazing. It's a site that's filled with huge old trees, just like the rest of the garden, mostly native trees. And again, we're working now in the earliest stages with Olin, who was our master planner, on a design to improve access and to create a plan that will take this amazing foundation and build something miraculously beautiful, completely accessible, and interactive, so that visitors now who come to this amazing place will be able to experience the Bronx River directly firsthand. So as I think here before Larry and I have a conversation, if we have time, I just wanted to thank you all for coming, and I wanted to read the acknowledgments, or a portion of the acknowledgments that I wrote, because in my research for this book, you uncover the great names, the Ethel Peckham and the T.H. Everett and the Elizabeth Britton and the Nathaniel Britton, and so on and so forth. And to the extent possible, I really tried to credit my amazing colleagues who I've worked with on these projects over the years, Kristen Schleider and Jessica Schuler and Deanna Curtis and Kurt Morell and Margaret Falk and all these amazing partners. It takes a team, it takes an army. But it was basically impossible to credit the group of people who I think are most responsible and have been most responsible over time for what the garden is. No good idea in a garden can be executed without gardeners to do the work. So what I wrote is, since its founding, many NYBG people have become known and celebrated for their professional accomplishments. Many, many more have done and still do the essential work of the institution without fanfare or due credit. Anyone who enjoys even a moment at the garden owes a debt of gratitude to the horticulturists past and present who have expertly tended its gardens, plant collections, and natural landscapes day after day since 1895. Their dedication to excellence is as inspiring as a result of their unsung labor. You cannot overstate how fortunate we are to have the team of horticulturists that we have who do this work day in and day out. And if I think of anything, I think of this book as a tribute to our amazing founders, our amazing leaders over time, but mostly the amazing people who care for the garden. Yeah? I think we have a few minutes. Larry, you want to come up and we'll have, you guys, if you have any questions for Larry or for me, we'd love to hear them.
I guess this is more of a photography question, but whenever I go on a garden tour, I love it when it's a cloudy day because for me, my pictures turn out much better because there's not so much contrast.
Right.
But then we had a speaker come the other day to our garden club and who has done lots of magazine covers and whatnot. And he kept saying, sunny, but early in the morning and late to get the drum. But how do you feel about that?
I shoot at noon. There's a photographer wonderful photographer, who shoots at night, and he says when he arrives, everybody leaves. When I get there, no one's around. And the reason is, if you're photographing under the trees, you have, it's great because you have the light coming in filtered through the trees and so forth. And I'm sort of joking about exactly what the time is. But the morning is always very, very good. Of course, the light is soft, and in the evening, it has a kind of glow. And, so it's easier to capture in a way, and you have a mood. But in midday, which most people don't ever shoot, you can get all kinds of shadows, and you can get a backlighting, which is sort of wonderful. You can't get it on a cloudy day, and you can't get it in the evening, but the backlighting really makes for sort of accents and interesting shadows and beautiful light.
What became clear in your acknowledgement is that this garden exists because of the care and consideration of, the founders, philanthropists, but as you acknowledge the staff, and you've heard your principles for gardening with nature. What are your principles for engaging, motivating, and guiding your staff?
The question was, what are the principles for engaging and motivating and guiding staff? And it's a wonderful question. Thank you. And what I would, the best advice is to have a clear vision, to listen as best you can, to get out of the way when you need to, and to get in the way when you need to. And that just becomes something that I hope is instinct. The reality is that there have been several heads of horticulture over the history of the institution, and I don't think any of us has been particularly adept at managing people. I think the institution itself draws people who have careers, who are inspired to do good work. So that's the staying out of the way part. Recognizing talent, which is probably the best thing anybody can do, and supporting that talent as best you can.
Let me add something about the photography. One of the things I've been recently doing is actually getting in under the trees. So we have these groups of trees, which is sort of wonderful, and they have magnificent shapes. And if you walk under the trees, and as they did with the veil and so forth, you get wonderful photographs which are abstract and at the same time play with the light. Yes?
Okay, hi. In terms of climate change, I know that with my small urban garden, 60 feet by 22 feet, it's a heck of a challenge to try and figure out what to plant where, how things are growing from year to year. I can't imagine the task for the garden. How are you dealing with the global warming?
That's another excellent question. Thank you. For years, and some of you might have seen it, I used to do a program called Gardening in a Changing Climate. And some of the things that we're doing are just experimenting with hardiness zones and pushing the ranges of plants. The ladies' border, which is just adjacent to the conservatory, is a place where we planted half-hardy plants or plants not normally considered hardy. But the reality is, I feel that gardeners are kind of ahead of the curve when it comes to climate change because we already take the weather personally. We already assume that things are conspiring against us, and we sort of can deal with death and loss pretty effectively. So we're leaning into our natural tendencies. But in all seriousness, I think the place where we're going to learn the most about gardening in a changing climate is in the research we're doing in the forest. Because just in observing the forest through our restoration work, and again, that's very simple work, we're removing invasives, we're planting natives, we are seeing how the native flora that is here is adjusting and adapting to climate. There's an extraordinary amount of information embedded within the response of nature to climate change, and we're paying attention very closely to that. Up the back there.
If I can just follow up on that, as a lover of hemlocks and seeing the historic pictures of the hemlock groves, I volunteer in the library and work with some of those archives. I also noticed that the few hemlocks still existing along the river are invaded with woolly adelgid. How does the garden deal with that kind of an invasion in the forest and with other species too, I presume?
So the hemlock, the forest, the Thane family forest, when the garden was established, as you saw, and as I said, it was called the Hemlock Grove because it had pretty remarkable stands of eastern hemlocks. It was considered the southernmost considerable aggregation of hemlocks along the eastern seaboard. That's a Britain quote, which means that it was a remnant hemlock forest, a post-glacial forest. And already as soon as the early 1900s, the hemlocks were already declining. And they were doing a lot of research in the 1910s and 1920s to try to understand why that was. Their conclusion ultimately was it was human feet were trampling the seedlings and compacting the soil and causing damage to the hemlocks. So that's when they put rails along the forest trails first. The damage that had been done and the naturally changing climate, then exacerbated by the changing climate, then exacerbated by hemlock woolly adelgid, has basically pushed hemlocks to the brink. In the 1980s, when the adelgid came in on the winds of Hurricane Gloria, it was considered that maybe the garden would spray the hemlocks. At that stage, it would have been horticultural oil, which is basically finely refined petroleum, but it was deemed both incredibly expensive and actually probably damaging to the river and the surrounding environment. So then the decision was made to see how the hemlocks would respond on their own, and they responded in the way that you have seen, that we have seen. But what's amazing, as I said before, to the answer about climate change, the forest was never entirely hemlocks. Excuse me. And the oaks and the sweet gums and the tulip trees and the sour gums and the maples that were at the edges or the margins mostly have come in to fill in that growing space. And the work that we're doing in the forest now is to, again, just like we do with the staff, is to kind of get out of the way. We don't want to determine what trajectory the forest is going to take because we don't know what's coming down the pike. But what we're seeing is that there's a tremendous diversity of native tree species in particular that are proving adaptable enough to fill in the gaps left by the disappearance of hemlocks, which is good because we're also on the precipice of losing all of our beeches to beech leaf disease. We lost all of our chestnuts to chestnut blight in the early 1900s. It's just been a series of these devastating losses, which would be extremely depressing if you lingered on it. But what's heartening for me is that the forest is actually still dominated by native trees, partially because we've been doing the work over the past 20 years. But the only work we've been doing is to try to help the forest do its own work at its own speed, at its own time, which has been amazing to see. Hi.
Is there an historical record of the plants, the understory plants that grew with the hemlocks in this forest?
Yeah, so the question was, is there a historical record of the spontaneous native flora in the forest from the 19th century? And the short answer to that question is yes, and it's one that we're using to consider reestablishing some of the populations of wildflowers that have disappeared. But the garden was founded by botanists, and it was run by botanists until 1980. So from 1891 to 1980, there was a PhD botanist ran this institution. And botanists are inveterate catalogers. The first thing they do is catalog the plants, in their backyard, in the garden. And so we have amazing data from the late 19th century about what was here. And that data will be very useful as we try to sort of reestablish some of these wildflowers that Elizabeth Britton saw disappearing in front of her very eyes.
Just another question on top of that one. Were the plants grown under hammocks, they would be different from deciduous understory. So I'm wondering if planting, like if I were to plant a hammock, and we have a few hammocks on the property, maybe it would be worth, and we have deer, putting an exposure and planting what would naturally have been under the hammocks themselves.
So the question is, would it make sense if restoring a forest or protecting a forest that still has hemlocks to focus on wildflowers or other plants that seem to have an obligate relationship with hemlocks? And the short answer to that question is yes. And the best way to learn about that, unfortunately, botanist floras are not necessarily organized in that way. They're more like lists, and they don't have necessarily the ecological detail that would help you make that decision. So the best way would be to go to a place like Mianus River Gorge, which still has some remnant hemlocks, old hemlocks. It's in Greenwich and adjacent New York. Or even better, go to New Hampshire or Vermont or Maine, where there still are wonderful groves of hemlocks. And you'll see things like Epigea repens, a lot of acid-loving plants that are quite beautiful. Kathy.
Larry, was there something that Todd asked you to photograph that you perceived as ugly that you couldn't make pretty?
Well, this was a real collaboration. I mean, I walk around and I take whatever I want to take, but we got together, and actually, we started out by Todd giving me a tour. I've been here for years and years and years, but I got a tour because I had to see it from the way Todd saw it. And so there's nothing that's ugly. The question is, how do you present it, really is really the issue. How do you make it interesting? How do you make it beautiful? And sometimes it takes real work. But the garden is lovely. I mean, what's interesting about the garden for me is, in a way, it's always been a big surprise. I came to the garden because I was a lawyer, and I was brought in because there was a legal problem, and I solved the legal problem, and we wound up with getting what we thought was a liability became an asset. And so I was asked to be on the board, and I would come here and never walk in the garden. And one day, I started photographing. Really, I started very late in life. I started photographing my own garden, and I said, I should take a walk in this garden. And so I started, and I came on the weekends because I was very busy. Very early in the morning, I would get here, and since I was a board member, they sort of let me in, and I would walk around and take pictures. And it took a number of years before people got very curious as to what I was doing. But the point is that the garden just attracted me. I couldn't get enough of it. And so where I had started as this was a major intellectual and financial and interesting, corporation, I forgot about the corporation and got down to the business of really just enjoying it. And and I followed the trees. I love the trees, and I mean, the magnolias, every time I go to the garden, the first thing I do, no matter what, I photograph the magnolias. They're just gorgeous all year long. So there's nothing else.
What do you shoot with? Do you have a preferred lens?
Yeah, well, what happened is I used to use lots of lenses. I had a Nikon camera for years. I used lots of lenses. And over time, I got to a medium format camera, and then I had Pentax, and I used lots of lenses. And I'm now using a Hasselblad, and I use just one lens. Because it's a 100 meg camera. But I use, it's from a 35 millimeter point of view, it's about a 24 to 70 or something like that. It's just within that range. And I found the less is more because really you either step back or you walk in close. You know, to have, when I was photographing Niagara and I was on the Canadian side and shooting the American side, it was good to have a long lens. I couldn't get across. You know, but in the garden, you can get wherever you want to be. So if you want to be back, you stand back. And if you want to get in close, you get in close. You don't have to change lenses. You don't need a lot of equipment. The most important thing, and it distinguishes me from most of the people I see photographing here, I come with a tripod. Okay. And the reason is, if you look at these photographs, I've been photographing for a number of years. We finally had a show, and we blew up the photographs and discovered they're all out of focus. So the lesson was, I shave, and you have to be still.
Yes.
You mentioned that there is a different philosophy about turf. Did I understand you correctly that there is the old way of thinking about turf and a new way of thinking about turf? Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, so the question was, I mentioned that our approach to lawns is evolving at NYBG, and what I will, and I'll give you a little bit more information. So when the garden, like all wonderful horticultural institutions, has used every modern technology available to it as a modern technology has emerged, right? So in Britain's time, it was literally, they had horses, and they used the horse manure for fertilizer. They hayed. There was very little technology. But then ultimately, after World War II, when all of the agricultural chemicals became available, and because of all the pests and diseases we had, those were all applied here for a long time. And then for a while, there was a sense that a perfect lawn was the thing that kind of indicated competency better than anything else. And there's some validity to that, but not entire validity to that. So over the past 20 years, we've drifted away from that. We don't have a perfect lawn anywhere in the garden. And so what we want to do now is to take that concept of, okay, you all are all still here, our lawns are not perfect, and you guys are still here, so that's good. Well, what's the next step? What if we change our mowing routines to make lawns less work? What if we add mixtures of native wildflowers into the lawn mixes? What if we don't worry so much about some weeds and focus our efforts only on weeds that are damaging or invasive? And so in the Magnolia Collection project, we're going to try a lot of those theories. We're going to change mowing regimes. We're going to add interesting wildflowers to support pollinators, but also to extend the season of interest. So to have the utility of the lawn, people can walk up to a tree and read a label, and that's an important part of who we are as an institution, but add a level of ecological sophistication and beauty. That's the goal, wish us luck. Sorry, in the middle.
Yeah, Todd, the discussion of the evergreen nearly dead led me to think about the other nearly dead deciduous like elm and, of course, chestnut. What is the garden's role in
Yeah, I think so. So the question was, what can NYBG do, not just to communicate about issues with our trees and our plants, but to help solve them, perhaps through plant breeding or plant selection? Can we bring back the American chestnut, or can we bring back the American elm, or can we head off beech leaf disease? And the short answer to that question is the best thing that we can do with the way we're currently situated is to work with researchers everywhere to figure out what the best methods are for protecting and preserving what we have. So for example, Robert Bartlett is on our board, and they have a wonderful research lab, and they are very generous with that information. So we get best practices maybe before they become more widely available. And then our role as a public education institution is to share those with our audience. So that's one thing we do. We do pay attention all the time. And if we notice that we have an ash that's resistant to emerald ash borer, or a beech that's resistant to beech leaf disease, then we will have the capacity to share that with other people. But we don't have a plant breeding program per se. We do work with plant breeding programs to introduce plants that are resistant to diseases. So for example, one of my many subversive goals is to make it so that you can see a flowering dogwood during flowering dogwood season. We're just coming to the end of that now, wherever you are in the garden, because in the 1930s, flowering dogwood was the most abundant tree at the New York Botanical Garden because it was all over the place in the forest. But because anthracnose came and wiped out almost all of our native dogwoods, really the only dogwoods we have now are cultivars that have been bred for their, or selected for their resistance to anthracnose. And we've been adding those everywhere. So you'll see dogwoods in the oaks, in the native plant garden, in the lilacs, and we're going to continue that work. We'll plant dogwoods in the magnolia collection. So one thing we can do is to share the breeding when that breeding emerges. Chris.
So when it comes to like your opinion on like curating a garden like this in places like heavily urban, like the people that come, they have a much like greater like disconnection from nature than other places and need to see something like that. Do you think it's more important for a garden to showcase like massive diversity or more like wow factors? Because like when I go to a place in the garden like the rock garden or the perennial garden, I'm more interested in like every little thing that's around and all the different labels and trying to see how much is put into one space when we have like daffodil hill or magnolias, which are really meant to just like captivate a person and bring like massive attention to it.
So the question was, what do we focus on more? Diversity, because we're a botanical garden and we love plants, or display, because we're a botanical garden and people love beauty? And the simple answer to that question is, here at the New York Botanical Garden, you don't have to choose. We literally have both, and we will literally drive both of those the best we can. Now, one thing that's interesting is that, there's so much information to go through, but the garden's size and shape has changed several times, and some of the original collections established in the early 1900s were lost in 1937 and have never really come back. We've only really reestablished some of those historic collections if they have either important conservation value or important aesthetic value. So there's not a coincidence that our tree collections are things like magnolias and cherries and dogwoods and maples, and that our shrub collections are lilacs and rhododendrons. But within those groups, which are very beautiful, we try to maximize the diversity of our collections, both wild type species for conservation purposes and also cultivars for ornamental purposes. So come to the New York Botanical Garden, where we try to do everything for everybody all the time. Thank you guys so much for coming and for your great questions. I really appreciate it.